I've been cooped up in the greenhouse for too long, so I've decided to go out and see what kind of awesome cactus locations I can find in this great city of Sydney. I'm on my way right now to Sydney's Royal Botanic Gardens, where I know they've got a fantastic succulent garden. Cool succulents, amazing cacti, some really weird cordiciform plants, and I know at this time of year as well, they'll have some amazing aloes in flower. So stick with me as we go for a little wander through the Botanical Gardens succulent garden. So you get to the front entrance and you're greeted by this garden bed full of amazing Echinocactus grusonii. Huge clumps, they're doing pretty well. One of these plants would actually be the parent of the seedling I've got at home. Don't know which one. They've got some spent flowers that are here, but oh yeah, you can see there are seeds in the tufts at the top. Real interesting. Don't think any of these are going to turn into seedlings. Now the interesting thing about Echinocactus grusonii is that they're actually really endangered. They're used in landscapes all over the world. So, you know, you kind of wonder how can they be an endangered plant, but in their native habitat in Mexico, they inundated the valley that they grow in naturally with the construction of a dam, and so there aren't that many of this species left in habitat. And yet wildly, they grow everywhere. They're farmed commercially all over the world for use in landscapes. Get them big enough and they make these amazing clumps. Anyway, it's an interesting start to the day. I'm going to head inside now and see what kind of weird stuff we can find. About a 5-minute walk from the front entrance, we find ourselves in this incredible and seemingly fairly secluded space. Succulent gardens here are divided up into 3 areas, I suppose. You've got on this side what we call the old world succulents, succulents that come from Africa. On this side, we've got new world succulents from the Americas, where you're going to find your cacti, and there's a central section at the very back which we might call an abomination against nature, a section created by an Australian celebrity gardener which really has got no consideration of botany nor, in my opinion, aesthetics. Just a random hodgepodge of plants thrown together in what I think is a pretty garish display. But we'll check it out anyway. So we might start with the African plants. As you can see behind us, there's some aloes in flower right now and a bunch of other really strange and curious things. So we'll go for a wander and see what interesting things show up. So if we start in the African garden now, it gives a real sense of what giving your plants a bit of space can do, that they can grow into. Have a look at this absolute monster of Euphorbia candelabrum. Might be a bit hard to see, but if we zoom in, completely covered as well in hundreds and hundreds of seed pods. Fantastic. A couple of quite impressive aloes in front of it. Aloe ferox in flower. Nice sort of dusky orange flower. And if I come around here, you can actually see a little juvenile Euphorbia candelabrum. I guess it's a cutting, also covered in those seed pods. Good start. Let's keep exploring. Now here's something really cool. This is a Euphorbia texere. You can see it's currently in flower, those little yellow flowers up the stem. There's also a couple of little maroon seed pods on it, little bulbous things. Now, looking around the garden itself, don't actually see any other Euphorbia texeres. It says to me, in all likelihood, given their proximity, the father of this plant is that whopping great candelabrum. So those seed pods are going to have probably quite interesting hybrids in them. Don't imagine the garden staff are going to be harvesting them, which is a shame. They'll probably just pop off and land in the gravel around this plant and never germinate. Bit of a waste. You can see this plant is really well labelled. Helps me know what it is, but a lot of the plants in this garden have got no ID whatsoever. So if I'm a bit general today, you'll have to excuse me. I know some of these plants visually, but many of them, especially the aloes, I have a bit more trouble with. You can see the aloes in flower now. Look, here's a bird. Native noisy miner getting in there. doing a bit of God's good work. These plants, the flowers are designed for pollination by birds, and although they're African plants, I guess it seems like our local Australian natives do a pretty serviceable job as well, because if I look closely, I can see some seed pods developing on this guy as well, so pretty spectacular. Good to see it in action as well. Who knows what they're going to do with those seeds either. In the midst of the African section, we have this little island. I suppose it's fairly appropriate. Little island separate from everything, where we find all these Madagascan plants. We've got, for example, an absolutely hectic bush of Euphorbia millii. You can see it's in flower right now. Don't want to stick your hands in there, that would be an absolute nightmare. Some species of aloe in the background as well, and what I'm assuming, some sort of Euphorbia vigarii, currently dormant. They've only got a couple of leaves on them, so they're a bit gnarly looking. But the real thing that's interesting in this section, they're quite impressive specimens of Aloes. We've got, for example, this guy here. Have a look at this. Aloes are like these real spiny, tall, spindly things, and when they're in active growth, they're covered in little sort of semi-succulent leaves. When they're dormant, most interesting thing about them are their spines. Let's see this one, Aloes dermosa. Now, not something you see every day, but if we come around over here, we've got some Aloes procera, which far more common in cultivation, and you can see those succulent leaves. These things make massive forests on Madagascar. Absolute beasts of a plant. Really, really interesting. And then there in the background, there's another huge one. What an absolute incredible specimen. You can't talk about Madagascan plants and neglect, of course, the ever-present Pachypodium lemerii. This one ain't looking too hot. The growth points are a bit gnarled. I'm not sure if it's been happy over this winter, but over here there is one that's looking much happier and healthier. Get a load of this. I love Pachypodiums. They've just got these incredibly gnarly spines. Check that out. And of course, when the growth season arrives, when spring comes, top of this plant will be flush with big green leaves. And we'll also have these kind of creamy white flowers. Pachypodium lemerii, really easy plant to grow. They're pretty hardy. Can even grow them indoors if you give them enough light. So, interesting one. Of course, they need a bit of space, but if you want a statement plant, outstanding. Now, these are what we would call a pachycall tree. Pachycall essentially meaning that they've got a fattened base. Sit there alongside our cordex plants. Technically not a caudiciform plant because they don't have that real fattened underground water storage, but Pachycall certainly has its space in the succulent world. And these plants are loaded with water, really, really capable of withstanding drought. So I'm just wandering along, enjoying the sights of the Euphorbias and the Aloes, and I saw something I didn't expect to find here. How about this? This is a succulent pelargonium, Pelargonium carnosum. Absolutely amazing plants. They're winter growing, so they go dormant in summer. And you can see those really fat, gnarled, succulent trunks under there. Quite an old specimen. The wonderful thing about succulent pelargoniums is, first of all, they've got these beautiful flowers. This one has just got a couple of flowers coming out just now. Little delicate, creamy white things. Amazing. And in some species, the leaves have an amazing scent, really beautiful aroma. You get, you know, sort of lemon scented or perfumes and all sorts of things. This one doesn't really smell like much, but surprising thing to find here. I never thought I'd be coming across a doozy of a Pelargonium carnosum. Amazing. I think there's actually 2 plants in there. Absolute stunner. Got a couple of seedlings of these guys growing. Tiny. These guys in front of me must be, you know, decades old. to reach a size like this. What sort of dickhead steals from a Botanic Gardens? Honestly, pull your heads in, hey? Absolutely appalling. Anyway, let's move on to the rest of the African section. Over here we can see my old nemesis, Euphorbia terricali, which of course stars in my poisonous plants video. One of the most toxic plants you can imagine. Just burn you straight. No good. Anyway, but more interestingly, have a look at this Cyphostemma juttae. Again, another pachycalled plant. This one, I'm assuming, not doing too well given the supports around its trunk, but currently dormant, so it doesn't look like much. When it warms up though, it's going to put out these big kind of leathery leaves. It's actually related to grapes. And when it flowers, each flower will transform into a seed pod that contains a single seed. And they look like red grapes. Absolutely amazing. Problem is they're not edible, full of oxalic acid. Just burn your mouth straight up. Not ideal. So as juicy and delicious as they look, don't want to go getting into this grape relative. We've got a couple of these guys. If I notice another one, I'll share it with you, but this is definitely the best specimen. Looks like it's had a bit of a prune to help keep it happy. It's against that amazing backdrop of aloes. Euphorbia amac just behind it. Seeing those pop up in gardens all over Sydney. Absolutely stunning. Lots of people poo-poo the common crassula ovata for being a bit of a beginner plant, and it is. It's a really simple, very easy plant to grow. You can grow them from leaves even. But have a look at the size and the gnarled state of this very old specimen. It's stunning. And it's certainly worthy alongside any other pachycalled plant as a plant worth growing. I love the fact that this one's getting in age. It's got some lichen growing on the stem. It's almost replicating that natural form. And what a bonus, it's in flower as well. Amazing plant. Nice little pathway through the African plants. You can see the aloes here, all in flower, and these Aloes speciosa, absolutely covered in seed pods. Pretty amazing how plants from different parts of the world can be ripped up, transplanted, taken halfway across the globe, and they thrive just as well. Look at this, here we go. Bird getting in amongst this Aloe comosa, doing a bit of pollination. That's a noisy miner, Australian native. Off it goes. See you later, buddy. Now check this one out. Aloe marlothii. These grow into huge trees. But how about the spines on those leaves? Outstanding. Love to come back in 10, 15 years and see what an absolute monster this has turned into. Now this is a curiosity. Now I wish I knew what it was. It's some sort of Euphorbia. I can identify that based on its flowers, but I'm not too well versed in these sort of upright stick growing forms. Anyone know what this is? I'd love to know. And speaking of identification, here's another upright form. Have a look at this. Behind this aloe here, this huge tree in what almost looks like Solenocerius, a cactus, but it's not. This is some giant tree growing Euphorbia, and all those little branchlets, I suppose, are succulent stems. But have a look at the trunk that it's growing from. Now, I had a look, there's no tag on this plant, so if you know what this is, I'd love to know as well. Shoot me a comment. Some more beautiful kind of semi-shrub like Euphorbias. And then we come to this absolute beast of a specimen. It's dormant. This is an Uncarina grandidieri, which will have the most amazing flowers when it's in growth, but for now it's just this amazing tangled mess of branches emerging out of this thick pachycalled trunk. An absolute beast. And then behind it, another beast. We've got another Cyphostemma juttae just kind of lurking in the background, waiting to break out of dormancy. You can sort of see why I love this place. So much variety, and there's some really interesting plant species that we don't see every day. Amazing. We continue on. a Pachypodium. It's not in flower and it's not in growth, so it's going to make it a bit hard to identify. Looks a bit like a Baronii or Windsorii, but without flowers and without leaves. And the fact it's looking a bit worse for wear makes this one a bit hard to identify. And of course, from its base, we've got really gnarly red flowering form of Euphorbia millii. Great plants for the garden, but I'm not sure about those spines. Anyway, we continue on. Now Africa is starting to thin out a little bit, but before we depart, we have a couple of absolute monsters to look at. Have a look at these tree aloes. I'm assuming Aloe barbarae. Recently, I think, reclassified to be aloedendrons. Anyway, aren't they massive? Huge beasts. Fantastic landscaping plants. You do see them sometimes around Sydney, but nothing anywhere near this big. There's a helicopter going overhead. Keeping an eye on me maybe, seeing that I'm not stealing plants. Never would I do such a thing. And now we jump over to the Americas, where we're going to see a whole variety of very different families of plants. Of course, this is where we're going to find cacti, native only to the Americas. We've also got a whole bunch of plants from the Asparagaceae family, plants like your Yuccas and Agaves, Nolinas, Dazzlerians, and so on. There's also a few kind of curiosities amongst these plants, but really at this point we're mostly leaving the Euphorbias behind. We're certainly leaving behind the aloes, except for that strange aloe that's out of place. Now the first plant that's well worth pointing out here, this is a fantastic monstrose or mutant version. The label says that it's Cereus uruguayanus. Typically this, I would say, is grown as Cereus repandus monstrosus in culture. I don't know if they've got different information or if this is a different form, but anyway, very interesting and fantastic and enormous mutant plant in the collection. And in front of it, just a few nice agaves. I'm not particularly well versed when it comes to agave identification, and a lot of these plants aren't labelled, so you'll have to excuse me if I've got no idea whatsoever about what I'm talking about. Now, speaking of curiosities, here we've got Fouquiera fasciculata. This is a Mexican cordiciform or pachycol plant, defined, you can see, by that very fat base just there. And also, how gnarly are these hectic spines? Don't want to get too close to that. Now, Fouquiera is a plant family that I don't know too much about. Picked up my first one, Fouquiera splendens, just the other day in that massive Cortex plant haul that I videoed. But you know, the joy of growing plants, hey? There's always new things to discover. And speaking of discovering things, why on earth do we have this huge Euphorbia in the Americas section? That's certainly out of place. Anyway, we'll forgive the ground staff for that little mistake and move on. Here's an interesting plant, and I wish I knew what it was. I have to assume it's a cactus. I can identify that because the spines coming out of it are emerging from areoles. That's the points, the growth points on cacti. But, you know, the spines always come from. That's how we can identify them against Euphorbia. But as we see, it grows into this big tree. Lots of spindly branches coming out. I'm going to assume it's something like a Pereschia because it doesn't look like a particularly succulent plant, but it's not anything I'm particularly familiar with. Again, if you know, if you have any insights what this tagless monstrosity covered in spines is, please hit me up in the comments. Trichocereus spacianus, pretty common backyard plant, particularly in rural Australia. And we move along, and here's a beautiful big Myrtillocactus geometrizans. Have a look at that. Beautiful kind of branching shrub-like form. Those branches kind of take on a bit of a bluish hue, and the fruit, when it flowers, they're kind of like these little blueberries. Beautiful plant. Also makes a great grafting stock, quite fast growing, but lovely plant to grow in and of itself. And then in the background here, we can see these tall plants. They're labelled Marginata, Cereus marginatus. These days, more commonly referred to as a Pachypodiums marginatus. Cockatoos are just going off in the background, clearly excited about what we're doing today. And yeah, beautiful plant. Mexican fence post, used quite literally in some parts of Mexico to create a living fence. I'm sure pretty effectively. They're covered in small spines. How good's that? Now here's a Pereschia. I know this is a Pereschia. It's actually labelled. This is Pereschia aculeata. As I spoke about in my Cortex haul video, where I picked one of these up for myself, they are an evolutionary throwback for cacti, because as you can see, they're covered in leaves, which is certainly not typical. The interesting thing, I suppose, about cacti is that their spines are a modified leaf. Because they grow in arid regions, they've evolved over time so that these spines now act as a form of protection and also reduce water loss, you know, through dehydration, through evaporation. And so here, this coming from tropical America hasn't needed to evolve in that way. And you can see this plant's interesting. It's covered in small fruits. Of course, these are going to be loaded with seeds. Those seeds potentially dispersed by birds. And that's why this plant's considered a bit of a weedy pest in Australia. Anyway, we continue on. For your well-being, we ask that you keep to the paths and avoid touching the plants, especially if you have children in your care. I feel like that goes without saying. Anyway, let's keep exploring. Rathbunia alamosensis. Here's a plant I know nothing about. Not looking too happy though. Wow. Sun stress, hey? See how this guy survives coming into spring. Now they've got all these amazing yuccas, like this guy here, but none of them are labelled. I wish I knew what these plants were. Certainly got Joshua trees in this garden, but again, because I don't know the first thing about yuccas, couldn't tell you which ones they are. Maybe someone more enlightened can inform us. It's kind of a trend today. I'm talking about members of the Asparagaceae family that I know nothing about. And adding to that, we've got a Nolina longifolia, which, massive tree. But the reason I wanted to point this out is, have a look at this impressive ridged-like pachycaul trunk. It's as good as any elephant's foot plant, any Dioscorea. I tell you what, incredible. And next to it, yet another member of the Asparagaceae family. I'm going to assume that this is some kind of Bocania. You can see these amazing caudex. Look at that, I love it. Huge water storage organ which enables it to survive extended periods of drought. Whatever sort of member of the Bocania family this is, we do see these sorts of things growing in Sydney suburban backyards, but nothing nearly as impressive as this specimen. Incredible. The way these plants have adapted to survive in the arid parts of the world always blows my mind. Look, there's another one just over the back here as well. Absolutely stunning. Can't get enough of this. And here there's a cactus, some sort of Pilosocereus, tufted woolly areoles, really quite beautiful. And from those areoles you'll see these quite delicate little flowers emerge. There's actually one in flower I can show you in a minute, but love these plants as well. Now here is a little family of Neobuxbaumia polylophas. Beautiful single columnar plants. And the reason I think it's worth showing you these is we've got a variety of sizes, but check out the monster in the background. Absolutely amazing. I can't believe how tall that thing's gotten. I think these are plants from Mexico. Beautiful, but the idea of a cactus that just grows in a single column without ever branching, it's a little bit bizarre, a little bit interesting, and really kind of brings into perspective that idea of columnar. Anyway, beautiful plants. Let's carry on. Here we go, another Fouquiera. This one, I'm assuming, is a little bit more opportunistic in how it takes up water, because you can see that it's fully leafed out now, and we've had a fairly wet winter, so typically I would have assumed that these plants would be winter dormant. This one either didn't get the memo, or it's more like a plant that will just put on growth whenever it receives water. Lots of plants will happily survive drought using that kind of system. So Fockiera digettii this is. Again, I wish I could tell you more about them, but a bit of a blind spot in my knowledge banks, I'm afraid. Beautiful plant though. Now the Botanic Gardens here, they've got quite an impressive collection of Opuntias, our prickly pear family. And these are those plants that kind of grow in pads, like this Opuntia rufida, so named for its red spines. Now the thing about our Opuntiads is that many of their spines are what we call glockids, tiny needle-like hairs. You can see them on the pad here. And if you've ever had the misfortune of touching these glockids, especially on a plant like, say, those bunny ears cacti that, I don't know, kind of crazily get labelled as a house plant, you just know that you're up for the most miserable experience of your life. Those tiny needle-like hairs get into your skin, they itch like crazy, and they're so hard to get out. I suppose a fantastic defense system, but why on earth anyone thinks that these are plants worth keeping in your own home, I have no idea. I'll show you some other of the Opuntiads in this garden as well, some that grow into these impressive tree-like forms. Very surprising in some ways as we move on. Here's Opuntia robusta from Mexico. This one is, I'm assuming, Opuntia ficus indica, the common prickly pear, grown all over Australia as a fruiting plant. But behind it, have a look at this. Now I'm not exactly sure what this species is, but the interesting thing about it is how it grows from a central trunk, absolutely covered in massive spines, until it starts to branch out. You can see this one's covered in fruit. I'm assuming pollinated by bees, maybe hybridized with some of the Opuntias around it. But it's really surprising how a plant that grows from these pads over time can thicken up, grow massive spines, and emerge as a trunk, because this is a plant that wouldn't ordinarily start off with a trunk like this. That happens over time, over many, many, many years, and eventually ends up turning into this tree-like form. Quite surprising how some of these plants can grow. At the back there, we've got Opuntia leucotricha. You can see some pretty gnarly spines, and behind it, the whole wall is covered in snake-like Solenicerius. Queen of the night, they have these beautiful, quite large white flowers that only come out at the night time, hence the name. Interesting feature. It'd be amazing to come back here on a night when this plant was flowering. Big old Hylocereus, the dragon fruit plant, I think, though it's been reclassified as a Solenicerius, grows really, really impressively in the tropical parts of the world, which is probably why in some ways this plant has come to be more commonly associated with Southeast Asia. Dragon fruit kind of seen as a Southeast Asian cuisine, but of course this plant originates in the Americas, Central America, where it grows as an epiphytic plant, or a plant that grows in trees. Beautiful specimen, quite a big one, and I'm sure probably prolifically fruiting plant as well, just not at this time of year. Now that takes us to the end of both the African and American sections of this succulent garden. Thought I'd take the opportunity now to provide a bit of an intermission. Some people have been asking me about the cool shirts I've been wearing lately. You're under no pressure to do so, but if you like supporting my channel, I'll put a link at the end of this video to show you where you can get some of this cool merch from. Anyway, now we're going to have a look at the monstrosity of celebrity gardener Jamie Drury's fairly hideous, in my opinion, succulent garden. Make no mistake, the plants in this garden are beautiful plants, absolutely incredible specimens. But the way that they've been arranged, the way that they've been displayed, in my opinion, is what makes this an unfortunate crime against the natural order of things. There's no organisation. I'm not even particularly fond of how they've been sort of placed into this rust-like sculptural sort of behemoth at its center. But anyway, let's ignore the unfortunate design choices that are presented to us and enjoy the plants for what they are. And we'll start at the beginning. Over here you can see we begin with some aloes. Don't know what they are exactly, but as we continue on we come to this amazing Consolia spinosissima. Amazing, because right now you can see that it's heavy with fruit. No idea how these things taste, but looks pretty impressive. Now, I suppose to sort of show just the concoction of random plants, this is a plant from Jamaica, and right next to it we can see some aeoniums, probably from the Canary Islands, I'm not exactly sure, alongside this beast of an aloe, which is certainly from the Africas. So, you know, so it begins. A hideous bringing together of plants from all over the globe. I'm imagining with very little thought whatsoever. Now the whole structure is going to be topped with some impressive columnar species, and starting with, on the far right, what I imagine is a Trichocereus terschekii, which is a South American plant. Quite an impressive multi-headed South American form almost of our North American saguaro. Big plant, lots of collectors enjoy these, particularly Trichocereus collectors. Across the top you can see some massive specimens of Euphorbia amac. Euphorbia amac is a Saudi Arabian plant. This is the variegated form, which we're seeing a lot of in landscapes in Australia at the moment. Then on the far left, some Aloes, those Madagascan columnar ones we saw a little bit earlier on. We've got some more Pachypodium lomerii, beautiful bottle-shaped form exhibited, although you can see one of them, not looking too crash hot, rot's kind of carved out a bit of a cavern into it. I don't know how that one's going to go from here. Sometimes these plants can recover on their own, but I'm not sure that one's going to overcome a gap like that. There is another couple of great Pachypodium lomerii just over here. In fact, this is one plant which is diverging at its base. You can see that branch-like habit there, related to our frangipanis or our plumerias, but as is quite evident, they're a whole lot more fierce with those impressive spines. Let's have a closer look. Now, I mentioned earlier the Pilosocereus here in flower. You can see these beautiful blue stems, which is kind of a glaucous exterior to protect them from the sun, but as you travel up the stems we can start seeing these quite delicate little flower buds. A few of them have opened, a little bit hard to see them too easily in this light, but an example that although we're in an unfortunately monstrous part of this garden, some of the plants are still pretty happy. Dracaena Draco from the Canary Islands with a couple of Mexican golden barrels in front of it. Beautiful branching habit. Now I really need to learn more about agaves because some of these plants are just so heavy metal. Don't know what species this is, there's no label. But have a look at those glaucous blue leaves with the most monstrous black spines on the end of them. Super impressive, super terrifying. I don't want to fall into a patch of these bad boys, I'll tell you what. This is an unfortunate example of poor labelling. Absolutely no idea what these are. Don't know where they come from, don't know anything about them. I'm assuming they're some kind of bromeliad from the Bromeliaceae family, but I know nothing about bromeliads, so maybe someone can help me out. But what I love about them is how they're essentially snaking out from their base across the cobbles here. Look at this. What an amazing plant. If anyone can tell me a little bit more about them, I'd love to know. Now, I'm not just going to poo-poo this odd part of the garden, because there are some design choices that I do quite like. For example, this Cactus straussii, in contrast against the rust behind it, really quite striking and bold. And we can see, I think, getting close, yeah, some seed pods forming on these plants, so it's a little bit exciting. Look at these, absolutely stunning. I have a Cactus straussii at home, nowhere near as big as these ones. Covered in fur, but the fur kind of belies the quite sharp spines within. Lovely plants. And then another Cactus here. This is Cactus tuberzensis from Bolivia. Don't know much about this one, but clearly shows you a bit of diversity in the Cactus family. Now, there's another cool plant here that has a really interesting contrast against the rust, and you've probably come to know how much I love Euphorbias. These ones here, they're labelled Euphorbia horrida, but in my opinion these are Euphorbia polygona varnivia, or snowflake. Big impressive specimens. These ones aren't looking too crash hot, but quite beautiful plants nonetheless, and I love how striking they look against their rust coloured backdrop. Now, we're kind of coming to the end of this section of the succulent garden, but it would be a shame not to highlight this for Crea McDougallii, which is a member of the Asparagaceae family, like your Yuccas, like your Agaves. In this case though, they grow into enormous trees. This one I suspect is just a little baby, and I'll stand next to it in a moment to give you a sense of scale, but an absolute beast as well, we can see. Now, that brings an end to our tour of this particular section of the Botanical Gardens, but before we go, there's some really important plants I want to share with you, including an absolutely amazing Australian succulent, which doesn't appear here, but I wouldn't want to go home without sharing it with you. Now, we're outside one of the greenhouses here, and I can't actually go in, it's blocked from public access. But if we have a peek inside, you can see this absolute beauty here. It's what's called an ant plant. These are plants, they're called myrmecophytes, and you can see that huge swollen tuberous base of this epiphytic plant, this plant that grows in trees, is punctuated with little holes. Now, what actually happens with these ant plants is ant colonies move in, create a symbiotic relationship with the plant. What that means is that the ants go about their business collecting food, and whatever scraps they leave behind act as a source of nutrients for this plant. Really interesting tropical species here. I don't exactly know what type it is. There are no doubt some ant plant enthusiasts out there that can provide a little bit more detail, but this is just an example of the sorts of crazy things that nature can come up with when left to its own devices. Anyway, a little bit more to show you. Let's keep wandering around. Check this Dracaena Draco out. Toppled over about 15 years ago. But have a look at the branching structure of this. Not only that, it's in fruit as well. Magic, absolutely magic. Here behind me you can see the Sydney Opera House, but more impressively you can see this Brachychiton rupestris, the Queensland bottle tree, which is probably Australia's most amazing pachycol plant. These plants grow in Queensland, as the name suggests, and just like all succulents, they are super hardy. Sometimes these plants get cleared as part of agricultural land clearing, and they can literally be lifted up out of the ground, root ball and all, transported hundreds or even thousands of kilometres across the continent, planted into a garden, and suffer no ill health whatsoever. And a lot of it, I'm sure, is because they've got this amazing drought hardiness from that thick, fat trunk which stores a lot of water and nutrients. An amazing plant and an incredible Australian native. Now, that's everything from me today on this journey through the Botanic Gardens. I hope you've seen some interesting things. I've got a link if you want to buy one of my cool shirts, or if you want to follow along, by all means. Otherwise, that's it for today. Happy growing, and I hope you learned something new and exciting. I'm going to go to the gift shop, see what they've got. Maybe some cool books or something. Anyway, that's it. See you later.